Okay, so today we're doing a deep dive into the world of the cerebellum. That little brain that's tucked away in the back of our heads.
Yeah.
And most people, if they know anything about it, they think balance and coordination, right?
Right.
But as I'm sure we're about to find out, that's a huge oversimplification.
It really is, yeah. For a long time, the cerebellum was sort of, I guess you could say, relegated to the sidelines of neuroscience research. But what's becoming increasingly clear is that it's anything but little in terms of its impact.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was preparing for a deep dive today, I was really struck by just how much the scientific understanding of the cerebellum has changed, even in just the past few decades.
Oh, absolutely. One of the most notable shifts, I think, has been a move away from viewing the cerebellum solely as a motor control center, to recognizing its role in a much broader range of functions, including cognition, emotion, and even social behavior.
As I was going through your materials, one of the things that really just hooked me was that case study from 1991. The college student who has this tumor removed from her cerebellum, and then suddenly it's like her entire personality changes.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, she couldn't write, do math, even recognize faces.
Yeah.
It's wild.
It is a wild case, and it really just sort of highlights how profound the cerebellum's influence can be on so many different aspects of our being. What's interesting, though, is that this wasn't an isolated incident. I mean, neurologists had been observing these seemingly bizarre, I mean, at the time, side effects of cerebellar damage for
So
years.
why weren't these cases taken more seriously then?
It really seems like a classic case of kind of scientific dogma, where the prevailing theory was so focused on the cerebellum's role in motor control that any evidence to the contrary was often just dismissed as, like, oh, that's an outlier, or that's an anomaly.
Yeah, like everyone had this neat little box for the cerebellum, and anything that didn't fit, they just ignored it.
Essentially, yes. But as technology advanced, we developed new tools for tracing neural pathways in the brain, and that's when things got really, really interesting.
Yeah, that's where things get really exciting, right? Because you're talking about scientists injecting viruses into neurons, making them glow, and you're basically spying on brain cells in real time. I mean, it sounds like something out of science fiction.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But for starters, what these techniques allowed us to do was to actually see the cerebellum in action.
Look.
So by tracing those neural pathways, we could see that the cerebellum wasn't just connected to the motor cortex, right? Which is the part of the brain that controls movement. It was wired to areas throughout the brain, areas involved in sensory processing, emotion regulation, even social cognition.
Wow. So it's like this hidden hub influencing everything we do. I mean, it really makes that old textbook definition of the cerebellum seem almost laughable now, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
it really does.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, as we began to kind of understand the sheer volume of information that was flowing through the cerebellum, it really started to shed light on why damage to this area could lead to, such a surprisingly diverse range of symptoms.
Right. It's not just about, motor skills.
Mhm.
And in your research, you dug into some fascinating studies on the cerebellum's role in sensory processing and how it all connects to autism.
Mhm.
One of the things that really stood out to me was the analogy of a loom. Could you maybe unpack that a bit for us?
Absolutely. So imagine, if you will, billions of neurons densely packed together, arranged in this incredibly precise, almost geometric pattern. And that's really what the structure of the cerebellum resembles, this loom. And it's this structure that's essential for its ability to process these massive amounts of information simultaneously, including sensory input from all over your body.
Okay. So I'm picturing it. So how does this loom actually work in practice? So let's say I'm walking down a crowded city street, right? What's my cerebellum doing during an everyday experience like that?
Okay, so as you're navigating that crowded street, right, your senses are being bombarded with all of this information,
Yeah.
right? Sights, sounds, smells, you name it. And your cerebellum is receiving all of that sensory input, filtering it, and helping you make sense of it all in real time. So it's coordinating your movements, making sure you don't bump into anyone, helping you adjust to the constantly changing environment around you.
So it's like the conductor of an orchestra, right? Making sure that everything's working in harmony.
That's a great analogy, yeah. Now, let's consider the experience of someone with autism, for example.
Okay, right.
Research suggests that the cerebellum in individuals with autism might be more sensitive to sensory input, particularly in social situations. So imagine that crowded street again, But this time, the sounds are amplified, the lights are brighter, every touch feels overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, that paints a very vivid picture of why someone might feel, overwhelmed in those environments.
Precisely. And so this hypersensitivity could explain why some individuals with autism are particularly sensitive to loud noises, bright lights, or even, social interactions, which, as you can imagine, really tend to overload the sensory system.
Right, right. Which makes me think about, that research that you shared from Dr. Yume Yang at the University of Minnesota. Her work showed that disrupting specific neurons in the cerebellum of mice actually made them less social,
Yes, that's right.
like noticeably.
And that's some really groundbreaking research because these mice, they didn't just become, a little less social. They displayed significantly less grooming behavior, which is a key indicator of social bonding in mice. And they actively avoided shared spaces. And so this really suggests a very direct link between these specific cerebellar neurons and social behavior.
Wow. It makes you wonder, if we could pinpoint exactly how these neurons contribute to social cognition, could it lead to entirely new approaches to, autism therapy?
Well, it's a question that, researchers are actively exploring. Now, it's important to remember that, mouse studies don't always translate directly to
Ah,
humans, and,
mm.
and the causes of autism are complex and varied. But, this research really opens up, I think, some very promising avenues for understanding the neurological basis of social behavior.
It's amazing to think, for so long, we basically just ignored this part of the brain that's so fundamental to how we experience, and interact with the world.
Yeah, it really speaks to, the evolving nature of scientific understanding
Yeah.
as we develop these new technologies and refine our methods.
Right.
We gain this deeper appreciation, I think, for the true complexity of the brain and
Yeah.
how much we still don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of complexity, we've talked about this loom-like structure of the cerebellum and how it processes sensory information. But what about these specialized cells within the cerebellum itself? I know you mentioned Purkinje
Mm.
cells earlier. What makes them so important?
Purkinje cells.
Hmm.
These are the real workhorses of the cerebellum. So imagine, if you will, these large, elegant, fan-shaped neurons
Oh,
all stacked, layer upon layer
yeah.
to form these intricate networks.
Okay, I'm picturing it now like rows of trees in an orchard,
Yes.
all connected by this network of branches.
That's a great visual. And each one of these Purkinje cells receives input from, thousands of other neurons throughout the brain,
Oh, wow.
gathering information about everything from your senses to your current thoughts and emotions.
So it's like each Purkinje cell is conducting its own like mini symphony of information.
Exactly. And these cells, they integrate all this input and then they send out signals that help fine-tune our movements, regulate our emotions, and even shape our social interactions.
Wow. It really makes you appreciate, the sheer elegance and power of the brain.
Absolutely.
But it begs the question, if the cerebellum is involved in such a wide range of like higher level functions, then what does that mean for our understanding of consciousness itself?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean,
Mhm.
for a long time, consciousness was thought to, reside solely in the cortex, the outermost layer of the brain.
Right, right.
However, with discoveries like these about the cerebellum, we're starting to realize that consciousness is likely far more, how do I put it, distributed and
That's-
interconnected than we ever imagined.
So it's not just a little brain after all.
Not at all.
It's an integral part of what makes us us.
Yeah, precisely. And the most exciting part is that, we're really just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding all that the cerebellum does.
Right. Well, it really makes you wonder what other scientific givens might be overturned in the next few years. But this deep dive into the cerebellum has certainly been eye-opening.
It has.
And I have a feeling you're walking away with a whole new perspective on this, seemingly unassuming part of the brain.
I think so too.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us today. And until next time, keep exploring.